an empty house. The silence in David Mitchell's house wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that rang in your ears, that made you turn up the TV just to drown out the absence of small feet padding across hardwood floors and innocent laughter bouncing off walls. 4 days until his next weekend with the kids. 96 hours of rattling around in a house too big for one person, trying not to count the minutes. He stood in Emma's room, or what would be Emma's room, once he finished painting it the exact shade of lavender she'd picked out from 17 nearly identical swatches. The paint roller left uneven stripes on the wall, darker patches that somehow looked like shadows even though he knew better. They reminded him of the Rorschach tests Dr. Harris had made him take during the custody evaluation. Back then, he'd seen butterflies and flowers in the ink blots, given all the right answers to prove he was stable, reliable, fit to be a father. Now, staring at the wet paint, he saw different things. A woman's profile, a reaching hand, a screaming mouth. David blinked hard and stepped back, bumping into the stepladder. It clattered against the floor, the sound sharp and startling in the empty house. "Get it together," he muttered, running a paint-stained hand through his graying hair. The divorce had left him with joint custody, crushing alimony payments, and a desperate need to prove himself. This house, this massive, aging Victorian he'd bought for a steal, was supposed to be his fresh start. A place where Emma and Lucas could have their own rooms, where they could build new memories that didn't include raised voices and slammed doors. But 3 months in, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a terrible mistake. It wasn't just the endless repairs or the way the heating bill ate through his teacher's salary. It was the weight of the silence, the way it pressed against his eardrums until he caught himself holding conversations with empty rooms, the way shadows seemed to linger in corners long after the sun had moved on. His phone buzzed. A text from Karen, his ex-wife. "Lucas has a cold. If he's not better by Friday, maybe we should skip this weekend." David's fingers tightened around the phone. She'd been doing this more often lately, finding reasons to chip away at his time. First, it was soccer practice, then a birthday party, now a cold. Each cancellation left him alone with the silence for another week, another eternity of empty rooms and creaking floorboards that sometimes, just sometimes, sounded like footsteps when he knew he was alone. He started typing a response, deleted it, started again. Outside, the October wind rattled a loose shutter, a hollow, rhythmic tap-tapping that sounded almost like knocking. David ignored it, focused on finding the right words to prove he was still a good father, still deserving of his weekends. But in the back of his mind, a nagging voice wondered if Karen was right, if this old house with its shifting shadows and persistent silence was really the right place for children after all. Finally, he typed, "He'll be fine by Friday. The kids need stability. See you at 6. Send. No turning back now. The weekend arrived with a blast of autumn wind that swept dead leaves across the porch as David waited for Karen's SUV. The house loomed behind him, its Victorian gables casting long shadows in the setting sun. He'd spent the whole day cleaning, fixing, preparing, anything to keep his mind off the creaks and whispers that seemed to follow him from room to room. Emma bounded out of the car first, her backpack bouncing against her spine. "Daddy!" She crashed into his legs with the force of a small meteor. Lucas followed more slowly, clutching his dinosaur plushie, his eyes wide as he took in the house's imposing facade. "The renovations are coming along great," David said, more to Karen than the kids. She stood by her car, arms crossed, scrutinizing the peeling paint and weathered shutters. "I've finished Emma's room, and Lucas's is next." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just make sure the heating's working properly, and check for mold. Old houses like this." "I've got it handled," David cut in, perhaps too sharply. "Say goodbye to Mom, kids." That first night started well enough. They made pizza from scratch, leaving flour handprints on the counter and tomato sauce on their shirts. David had installed child-proof locks on the basement door and covered the electrical outlets, checked and double-checked every safety measure. He'd even bought nightlights for both their rooms, though Emma had insisted she was too old for one. It was during bedtime that things began to shift. "Daddy," Emma called from her new room. "The wallpaper's moving." David found her standing in the corner, staring at the section of wall he hadn't painted yet. The ancient wallpaper, with its faded floral pattern, curled slightly at the edges despite the fresh adhesive he'd applied. "It's just the old paper coming loose, sweetie. Tomorrow we'll finish painting over it." Emma shook her head, her finger tracing the pattern. "No, look, there are faces in the flowers. They keep changing." David felt a chill despite the heating running full blast. In the dim light, the floral pattern did seem to writhe and shift, revealing shapes that looked almost human. He blinked, and they were just flowers again. "That's just your imagination, Em. Remember how we used to find shapes in the clouds?" But later that night, after both kids were asleep, David returned to Emma's room. He stood in the darkness, watching the wallpaper, waiting for the flowers to move. The house creaked and settled around him, and somewhere upstairs, floorboards groaned under weight that shouldn't have been there. The next morning, while the kids ate breakfast, David ventured into the basement to search for more painting supplies. The previous owners had left behind stacks of newspapers yellowed with age. One headline caught his eye: "Local children removed from home after suspicious incidents." The date was from 15 years ago, the address unmistakably his. His hands trembled as he read further. The children had reported strange occurrences: voices in the walls, moving shadows, unexplained bruises. The parents had been investigated but cleared. In the end, the children were removed for their own safety after the youngest was found unconscious in a room that, according to the article, had no obvious means of entry or exit. "Daddy?" Lucas's voice floated down the basement stairs. "There's someone upstairs." David froze. "Stay where you are, buddy. I'm coming up." He took the stairs two at a time, the newspaper forgotten on the workbench. Lucas stood at the top of the basement steps, clutching his dinosaur. "In your room," Lucas whispered. "I heard talking." David's heart pounded as he climbed the main stairs, Lucas clinging to his hand. Emma's door was closed, though he distinctly remembered leaving it open. When he pushed it, the door resisted slightly, as if something were pressed against it. "Emma?" The room was empty, but the air felt thick, heavy with the scent of old flowers. The wallpaper section seemed larger somehow, the pattern more pronounced. Emma sat cross-legged in front of it, her hand resting on the wall. "They want to play," she said without turning around. "Who wants to play, Em?" "The children in the flowers. They're lonely." Thunder cracked outside, making them all jump. David hadn't even noticed the storm rolling in. Rain began to pelt the windows, and the old house groaned under the assault. "Emma, come on, let's go downstairs and watch a movie." But Emma didn't move. "They say there's a special room, a safe room. They want to show me." Before David could react, Emma pressed hard against the wallpaper, and her hand went through. The floral pattern rippled like water, and Emma disappeared into the wall with a soft gasp. "Emma!" David lunged forward, his hands hitting solid plaster. Lucas screamed behind him. The next minutes were a blur of panic. David sent Lucas downstairs with strict instructions not to move from the couch. He ran his hands over every inch of the wall, looking for seams, hidden panels, anything. The wallpaper pattern swirled beneath his fingers, but remained solid. In desperation, he began tearing at the paper, revealing layer after layer of patterns beneath. Flowers became geometric shapes, became more flowers, each layer older than the last. His fingers were bleeding from dozens of tiny cuts when he finally found it. A slight seam in the plaster, perfectly concealed by the patterns. The hidden door swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges. Beyond it lay a narrow room, walls painted with faded murals of children playing. Emma stood in the center, staring at something on the floor. "Emma, don't move." David edged into the room, trying not to think about the article, about the child found unconscious years ago. "Look, Daddy." Emma pointed at the floor. They left their toys. In the beam of light from the doorway, David saw them: antique dolls, toy soldiers, wooden blocks, all covered in decades of dust. And there, scratched into the floorboards, names and dates going back almost a century. Children who had lived in the house. Children who had found this room. "They just wanted somewhere safe," Emma whispered. "Somewhere the grown-ups couldn't find them when they were angry." David felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Generations of fear and secrets sealed up behind these walls. How many children had hidden here? How many parents had searched in panic? "We need to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "Right now." That night, during the worst of the storm, David sat in a motel room watching his children sleep. He'd called Karen, made up a story about a burst pipe. Tomorrow, he'd call a realtor. The house could keep its secrets, its hidden room, its shadows that moved when no one was watching. Some sacrifices were worth making, some hauntings weren't worth fighting. And sometimes the most terrifying ghosts weren't the dead at all, but the echoes of life that lingered in old walls, the tears and fears and desperations of families long gone, playing out again and again in an endless loop. David pulled out his phone and began composing an email to his realtor. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, his children slept peacefully. No whispers, no shadows, no shapes in the wallpaper, just the simple, profound silence of safety. And for the first time in months, that silence felt exactly right.